Today, we're going to be talking about one of the core models of memory that has come out of cognitive psychology. This is called the modal model of memory. So, what do we even mean when we say memory? This word it's actually a lot more complex, way more complex than we often realize. And so, in order to best understand memory, we're going to talk about it in the form of this model to help us break down its various features and components. And so one of the biggest distinctions we're going to make when we're talking about memory is between that of what has been termed short-term memory and long-term memory. And so psychologists historically had talked about these distinctions using various terms throughout the 19th century. But it wasn't until Hermann Ebbinghaus's wordless learning experiments in the late 1800s that we had empirical evidence for what would be called short and long-term memory. And if Ebbinghaus sounds familiar, we talked about him in the introductory lecture to this class. But to refresh your memory, I'll talk about his experimental methodology again briefly. So Ebbinghaus used nonsense words. They were made up of 3 letters, and this was in order to try to study how memory works without the confounding variable of word meaning being present. And so he was really a very meticulous researcher, and over several years, he used himself as his test subject, and he recorded how much practice he needed for list retention, how much relearning he had to do when revisiting the lists after a certain amount of time, and then how long he was able to retain these lists. And so he discovered a number of fundamental learning and memory principles. So the first one being that a small amount of practice helps with retention. It kind of bolsters our ability to remember, and it doesn't take a lot. Another principle is that he discovered is that learning in small spurts or small sessions is a lot better compared to trying to learn it all at once. And hint, these first 2 principles are empirical evidence for reviewing notes after each day of class rather than trying to cram. And so something else that Ebbinghaus's research led to was this idea of there being a learning curve. And so this is essentially a visual representation of proficiency and experience. And the idea here is that proficiency usually increases as experience increases. And so this is giving some credence to the saying of practice makes perfect, except obviously in this case, it's human learning. So practice makes close to perfect. The recency effect, this is a phenomenon that items that are presented most recently to us tend to be remembered. And so the idea behind this is that as these were the last items to be presented, they are quote unquote fresher in our memory because we've just heard them. Another phenomenon is called the primacy effect. And so this idea is that items that were presented first tend to be remembered. And do keep in mind that both the recency and primacy effect co-occur. So it's not necessarily one or the other. But we are seeing this pattern of, well, for example, if we're going with Ebbinghaus's list learning, right? The words in the first part of the list and the words towards the last part of the list are going to be remembered better than the words in the middle of the list. And so With the recency effect, this makes some intuitive sense, right? But the privacy effect is a little bit paradoxical in a sense. And so, how does this happen? And so, this primacy effect is evidence for a quote unquote sort of long term memory, or at least a longer term memory, in comparison to a shorter term memory that seems to support the recency effect. And so the the idea, the explanation behind the primacy effect is that the earliest items on the list have likely been rehearsed the most because of the way in which the words are presented one at a time. So generally, people approach this kind of task by just simply repeating the words over and over to themselves as they hear more words on the list. So let's say that the first three words on the list are book, dog, and car. So when you hear the first word, book, you repeat it to yourself. You're like, okay, book, internally. And then when you hear the next word, dog, you then repeat those two words in order to yourself. Okay, book, dog. Then when you get the next word, car, you do the same thing and repeat the list to yourself again. Book, dog, car. So this means that you've repeated the word book the most to yourself relative to the words that came after it. And this is the case for the words closer to the beginning of the list than it is for words that are closer to the middle. And so there's some further experimental support for this as the century moved on after Ebbinghaus. So we have some experiments by Rundis and Atkinson. And in their experiments, they found that the participants' probability of remembering a word was really strongly connected to the number of times that the word was repeated by participants as they were trying to learn a word list. And interestingly enough, there has been evidence to suggest that when there are words that are more familiar to us and also words that are more frequently used, the primacy effect is actually enhanced. But interestingly enough, not the recency effect. So it seems like maybe there are a couple of different processes that are going on in addition to the primacy effect and the recency effect, such that words that we're a lot more familiar with, or words that just occur in the English language more frequently are easier for us to remember if they are towards the first part of a list. And so Ebbinghaus's results, along with the experiments that followed it over the years, suggested that there are not only different kinds of memory, but like I said, different sorts of processes as well. And so eventually, all this different research on memory resulted in this standard model of memory by Atkinson and Shiffrin. And so this standard or modal model of way of understanding conceptualizes memory as this flow of information from this sort of one end of the memory system, so that's the sensory stores, to the other, which is the long-term memory. And it's this idea that the flow of information crosses three different memory stages. So we have sensory memory, short-term memory, and then long-term memory. So let's go ahead and talk about sensory memory first. This is sort of the first stage, because the sensory stores are the initial memory stores in the information processing system. Their job is to hold information for a pretty short period of time when it comes in from the environment. And the way in which the sensory memory is able to quote unquote hold this information is by using rehearsal. And so it's assumed that we have a sensory store for each of our 5 senses. And so if the rehearsed information from these sensory stores isn't transferred to long-term memory, it is thought to decay or be replaced by newer information. So sort of like erased or written over. And so in either case, this decay or erasure leads to what we call forgetting. So the sensory store that corresponds to vision is called the iconic sensory store. This holds quite a bit of information for short periods of time in an iconic or sort of picture-like form. And so a lot of the evidence that supports the existence of this kind of sensory store came from research done by a man named George Sperling. And he was interested in what he called the span of apprehension. More colloquially, we would call this our quote unquote attention span. And a better definition of this span of apprehension was how much information we could take in or encode just at one time. And to study this ability, he presented letters and numbers in rows and columns very quickly, 50 milliseconds. And this combination of rows and columns he called arrays. And so they were then shown to participants to see how much of that information that they could report. And so when he did this, he found that people on average were able to report 4 to 5 items in total from the entire array. And so a number of them did say that they knew that they had seen more items, but they had really faded away before they got a chance to report them. So these participants had this feeling of like, oh, like I know that there is more, but I can't think of it. I can't pull it out. And so based on this feedback, Sperling modified his task to try to get a more accurate measure of the, again, what he called span of apprehension on the basis of what his participants told him, that they were feeling like they had seen more, but they just couldn't remember it. It was just out of reach for them. And so this picture here on this slide shows this modified task. And so these two different sorts of approaches that Sperling ended up taking came to have different names to differentiate them. And so the original task has come to be called a whole report because participants were asked to report from the whole combination of rows and columns. And so the modified task that was based on participants telling Sperling, yeah, I know there's more, I can't remember what it is. This modified task is called partial report. And this is the picture that we see here on this slide. And this was because participants were asked to report from just one portion of the rows and columns. So in this partial report task, Sperling presented a 3x4 array, so 3 rows, 4 columns, and asked his participants to recall just one row of the array, so 4 items. But participants didn't know beforehand what row they were going to be tested on. So in order to perform well, they then had to have all of the information in their memory so that they could recall from any of the 3 rows. And so after the 12 letters were flashed, then a tone was sounded to indicate which row participants were to report from. And so this was done by the presentation of one of three pitches. So a high pitch tone meant that they were to recall the first row, a medium pitch was the second row, and a low tone meant the bottom row. And so as we can see in this picture on this slide here, so the tone that was presented here would have been like a medium pitch tone. And that was signifying to the participant, you need to recall, please recall the second row of letters that you saw. And so what Sperling found was that his participants were able to recall about 75% of the information from any given row. So able to recall 3 out of 4 items from a row. And so he then concluded then that about 75% of the information from the 12-item array that we see in this picture, so about 9 items, was available to participants from their memory. And he also found that these were the predictable results that happened when the cue for recall occurred immediately after the letters were taken off of the screen. But if there was even just a 1-second delay between when the screen went blank and then when the tone was sounded, people's recall dropped down to the 4 to 5 items that we saw when doing the whole report. And so these results then suggested to us that the iconic sensory store, it could hold about 9 items max. And also that it doesn't hold that information for very long. On average, about a quarter of a second or 250 milliseconds. So really brief in its ability to hold information. And so there was some further research done by Averbach and Coriel that helped refine our understanding of the iconic sensory store even more. And so even though Sperling had reduced interference just caused by kind of the overwhelm of presenting so much information to participants in the whole report version of his study, and that's why he made that modification to the partial report, where it was only a handful of rows and columns. These researchers, they were like, well, it could still be argued that, reporting, this instance of reporting, of having to draw from your memory, could still be causing some interference, and that Sperling's findings were actually like an underestimation of what can be held in the iconic sensory store. And so they tested this idea by presenting 2 rows of 8 randomly chosen letters for a duration of 50 milliseconds. And so instead of asking their participants to then report from a row of letters, they presented a small mark above one of the letters, which then the participants had to report. So this target that was telling them, oh, this is the one I want you to report. And so again, in this scenario, participants were able to report about 75% of the items that were presented. However, the total number available items for recall in Averbach and Coriel's study was actually 16, not 12. And so this finding of 75% in their study meant that they had evidence to suggest that iconic memory can actually hold 12 items rather than just 9. And so they also studied the nature of forgetting that takes place in the iconic memory store. And they experimented with presenting various covers or masks over items that were presented to participants. And they varied the presentation times following the targets. And so what these researchers found was that if they presented the mask within 100 milliseconds of the item or the target, um, the mask was then superimposed over the original item. So for instance, if the letter F was presented and then it was followed by the mask of an L, what the participant then ended up seeing was an E. So by presenting a mask within 100 milliseconds of an item, essentially our sensory store wasn't able to differentiate between the two and actually just blended together the features of the two different items it had seen. And then when they varied the presentation time, they found that at longer intervals, so if they presented it like later than 100 milliseconds, I lost my train of thought. So if they did longer presentations, so, say 400 milliseconds after presenting the target, the mask then ended up erasing or writing over the original stimulus. So if the L mask was presented later after the F, it would then erase it, and then L would become the answer that participants gave about what they saw, rather than an F. And so this phenomenon came to be called backwards masking. And here on the slide, I just have another example of that too. And so if this, like I said, if this mask here was shown about 100 milliseconds after the target here, there'd actually be this superimposed image that participants would report, where they would see the 4 boxes in the upper left-hand corner superimposed over this target box here. But if there was a longer amount of time between the presentation of the target and the mask, then participants would report just the shapes that they saw in the mask. They wouldn't report anything about the target. So, of course, we know that research is full of critics. And so a researcher by the name of Haber in '83 criticized this idea of iconic store research that had been done. And his critique was based on the ecological validity. And so if you remember, ecological validity is essentially a really fancy way of saying, how this happens in the real world. It's all well and good to replicate these studies in a well-controlled lab, under all these conditions, but how does that actually play out in the real world? Can we say that what's happening in the lab is actually analogous with what's happening outside of the lab in real life? And so his argument was that our perception of the world is continuous. It's not broken up into these brief flashes of stimuli, like the way that stimuli were presented in the labs, right? Where these flashes of targets and masks and things like that. But rather that the things that we encounter in day-to-day life are just continually present to us, rather than appearing as these more frozen, static snapshots. However, a researcher named Ashcraft argued against Haber's criticism in 2 ways. And so first was, he said that, well, although the perception of our world is that it's continuously present, the way that our eyes take in information is very much like brief snapshots. So, well, he was arguing that while our perception or the integrated sensory information is telling us, oh yes, this is one sort of continuous shot, but the way that sensation happens is more like brief snapshots. And so there's a couple of pieces of evidence to support this. And so We know that our eyes jump from location to location in our visual field, and that while they're jumping around, some of the information that's coming in is inhibited. And these jumping eye movements are called saccades. And so I have this picture here from a study that was done on just sort of like, daily tasks. And so in this study, they had people, they used eye tracking technology. So they had software that was tracking these saccades. And they were also tracking their fixation points as well. So where their eyes were moving and where their eyes were stopping as they were watching something mundane like a weather forecast. And so you can see here, the bigger dots represent more time spent looking at that area. So what we would call fixation. So this break in the jumping of our saccade-like eye movements and a focused target of our eyes. And so you can see that the saccades are they really jump around. It's not like we take in this like nice linear or coherent picture, but really our eyes really jump around. And when our eyes fixate, they do so for about 250 milliseconds, which is really quick. And so it's really as if we're looking at brief flashes of stimuli that are about 200 milliseconds in duration, which is about the length of time that an icon persists in our iconic store. So again, even though our perception is that we have this really smooth, continuous field of vision and eye movements, actually, when we look deeper at the sensory processes, it really is actually, our perception is really made up of these really brief snapshots. So let's go on to talk about another sensory store. So similar to the iconic memory store, it's also hypothesized that we have an echoic or auditory memory store, which is separate from the iconic memory store. And so researchers by the name of Darwin, Tuvey, and Crowder, they replicated an earlier study that was looking at echoic memory stores. And so this is a study done by Morey, Bates, and Barnett, and they just modified it. And so in this procedure, so participants listened to 3 messages total. So they wore headphones, and there was one message that was played into the right ear, and there was another separate message that was played into the left ear simultaneously. And then on a separate track on a stereo in the room, there was a third message that was being played out to the participant at the same time. And so the perception of this that participants had was that there are these 3 distinct messages. So one to the left ear, one to the right. And then in terms of the message being played out loud in the room, it felt like it was sort of coming to the center of their head, is what they reported. And so what the researchers did was they asked the participants to report as much of the 3 messages as they could. And not surprisingly, this sounds like a really hard task. People could recall very few items. They really didn't remember that much. But when there was this partial report modification in that they were asked to just focus on one reporting on one of the messages rather than everything that they heard. They did report more items, but it is notable that they still didn't report as many items as those who were in the partial report procedure of the iconic sensory store. So again, here, it seems like there are even more limits to our echoic sensory store, um, because even when asked to really narrow down on an auditory stimulus, people were not able to even report kind of the bare minimum of 3 to 4 that we saw in the visual modality. And one of these researchers, Crowder, also did his own independent study and demonstrated what has been called the suffix effect in our echoic memory stores. And so in this study, he presented participants with a random sequence of as much as 8 digits and presented them really fast. He presented 2 digits per second. And so, oh, I just realized that there, I made a typo on the screen. I was reading it. So it should say, for the random digit sequences bullet, it should say 2 every 1 second, not 1 every 2 seconds. Because 1 every 2 second would actually be pretty slow versus 2 digits every second. And then so after the last digit in the sequence, Crowder gave participants a recall cue that was either visual or auditory in nature. And then participants were asked to recall the digits in order of presentation. And so what Crowder found with the presentation of a visual cue was a traditional U-shaped curve showing the primacy effect and the recency effect. And so the reason for this was hypothesized that, well, in order to perform well on this kind of task, which is really challenging because you're given a large amount of auditory information very quickly, participants will try to transfer as much information as they can to their working memory and hold on to that information there. And the idea is that the last item or items on the list are still in the person's echoic memory store when the cue comes in. But because it's in a different modality, because it's a visual cue and they were given auditory information, it doesn't affect that information. It doesn't impact it. So when participants were given a visual cue, it wasn't conflicting with the modality of the information that they heard. But when there was an auditory cue that was present, they found that it actually diminished the recency effect. So participants had a lot more of a difficult time holding on to the most recent digits that were read off to them when they were given an auditory cue for recalling. And so this suggests that this auditory cue, it erased the items that were still in this echoic sensory store. Because again, the idea here is that it's the same sort of modality. And so the echoic store can only handle so much auditory information. And so we won't talk about all of the different sensory stores, but I just thought that this one was interesting. We also have the taste memory store, or the gustatory sensory store. Gustation is the fancy scientific word for taste. And Kelling and Halpern, they studied what they called taste flashes that came from participants receiving either a salty or a saccharin or sweet tasting solution being applied to their tongue for a series of different time intervals. So either 100, 200, 300, or 1000 milliseconds. And then once it was applied for the prescribed amount of time, then it was washed away with distilled water. And the design of this study was supposed to be analogous or comparable to the sort of quote unquote flash of letters in the Sperling task that was shown. Because the stimulus ended long before the subject could actually report it. And so these researchers found that the recognition accuracy was actually 68% for salt, and then 94% for the saccharin, for the sweet tasting solution. And this was true even at the shortest duration of 100 milliseconds. And so this gave us evidence that there must be some sort of gustatory sensory register that preserves taste information even when there's a really short presentation of it. Because otherwise the sensation would have disappeared before these subjects could actually identify it. And we wouldn't see these better than chance accuracy results. So now that we've talked at length about sensory stores, let's move on to the next step in this modal model of memory. And so this is the short-term memory. And we're going to talk about the capacity of short-term memory to help us better understand it. And so if you remember, we've talked a little bit about there being this sort of bottleneck, this slowdown in the processing system that happens in short-term memory. And there's this idea that although we can store a seemingly infinite number of items in long-term memory, the rate at which we can transfer or enter those items into long-term memory is then fully dependent on the characteristics and abilities of our short-term memory. And so even though our long-term memory is theoretically, hypothetically infinite, our short-term memory isn't. And we know this because of a number of studies, but a really foundational one that's become a classic in cognitive psychology is called the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. And this is written by George Miller. I believe it was sometime in the 50s, 56, something like that. Yeah, I still have lots of little fun bits and pieces of psychology trivia in my brain from taking history and systems. So those of you who are currently taking it, get excited or not. Those of you who have to take it, which you will if you're a psychology major, yeah, you might be really good at psychology trivia night because of that class. So anyway, let's move on. So in this classic article, he suggested that we borrow a unit of measurement from information theory to better help us understand our short-term memory capacity. And so this unit of measure is called the bit. And so the bit is based on the idea that the amount of information that is contained in a stimulus or event, this amount is what's critical to our memory of that stimulus or event. And so we are able to judge the informativeness, the informativity, how informative a stimulus is based on whether our ignorance is reduced and by how much. So essentially, within information theory regarding cognition, the bit is this idea that how much information, how much meaningfulness we can get from a stimulus or event or object or whatnot. And so another way of nuancing a bit is defining it as the unit of information that is needed to distinguish between two equally likely alternatives. So given two equally likely alternatives, let's say saying yes or no to a question, the amount of bits in the incoming information that we get regarding that decision is what is going to help us distinguish between these two alternatives. And so this is really just a complicated way of defining capacity, making it quantifiable and able to be measured. And so Miller took this concept of bits and was like, okay, well, you know, based on the mathematical formula behind this, I should be able to predict how many bits a human's short-term memory is able to contain. And so what he found was that the number of predicted bits of information was very inaccurate compared to the actual number of bits. And so essentially what he found was that, well, regardless of the number of bits in each item, people remembered a relatively constant number of items. So on average, people were remembering about 7 things, though this did range from 5 to 9. So you have this low end of 5 and this high end of 9. And this obviously gave rise to the name of this article. We have magical number 7 plus 2, which is 9, or minus 2, which is 5. And Miller called the number of items that we can hold, he called them chunks, which is maybe not as visually appealing as maybe another word, but it sticks with you. And like his article suggests, and like I've said before, he stated that we're capable of holding 7 plus or minus 2 chunks in our short-term memory. And so there were some researchers who criticized Miller's notion because they said, well, this is too vaguely defined. What even is a chunk, right? You know, we're supposed to be trying to make this measurable and quantifiable, and here you are talking about this vague word chunks. And so Miller agreed and was like, yeah, you're right, but the fact that this idea of a chunk is vague and more broad actually gives it an advantage, because what might be considered a chunk of information to one person may not be considered a chunk to another, and their memories for the information will reflect that. So as an example, let's say that you are getting a phone number from someone and you have to try to remember it. I know, this is really crazy. Believe it or not, this used to happen though, if you didn't have a pen and a piece of paper handy. I can still remember the phone numbers of like a couple of my really close elementary friends because I had it memorized because I didn't have a cell phone. And so rolling with this sort of old-fashioned idea, let's say that the phone number that you need to remember is one that's in the Santa Barbara area. So let's say that it's, I'm going to choose things at random, 805-467-2835. So technically, just looking at a phone number on its face, there are 10 separate pieces of information to remember. That is, there are 10 numbers. But with some chunking, I can already cut that down. So first of all, I'm already familiar with the area code. So I'm more likely to encode that as just one piece of information, 805, rather than seeing it as 3 separate pieces of information. So seeing it as, well, I have to remember an 8, and then a 0, and then a 5. And the format of phone numbers, I mean, at least the way that we have them set up in America, they also inherently chunk information for us as well. And this is in the form of that hyphen that comes in the middle of a phone number. So Again, let's say that the phone number is 805 467 2835. So maybe you see the 467 and say, oh, that's actually the street address for my old house, the house, my like childhood home. And then maybe you realize, oh, it's funny. My mom and my dad were 28 and 35 when they got married. And then suddenly it's a lot easier to remember this unfamiliar phone number than when you first started. And so by chunking, um, rather than having to remember all 10 of these numbers, we've really broken them up into just three separate sections to remember. So just have to remember what's the Santa Barbara, county area code. Oh, it's 805. And then what was my next cue? Oh, yeah, that's right. The address of the first house that I grew up in. And then, oh, yeah, I just have to remember how old my parents were when they got married. And then there, boom, there you go. So really three pieces of information rather than 10. And so also if we look at this example here, if you were trying to go to the grocery store and remember all of this, um, it would be pretty hard, right, to remember each of these words individually. But if you chunk it or organize it into these different categories of foods, it's a lot easier to remember, okay, what are the frozen foods? Okay, oh, that's right, ice cream and then frozen peas. Okay, what were the fruits and veggies that I need to get? Okay, when I'm in the produce section, it's, oh, lettuce, bananas, tomatoes, and apples. Okay, got it. So there is a lot of evidence for this idea of chunking that then, of course, came after Miller's article. And if Miller is correct, then we should be able to chunk information in different ways and then show that these different chunks are then remembered or forgotten equally well. And so Murdoch showed that this was actually the case. And he found that that three words decayed as fast as three letters. And also that three letters decayed faster than a three-letter word. And additionally, Simon, who actually originally was a critic of Miller's and this idea of chunks, eventually came around and argued that the amount of time that it takes to transfer information into our long-term memory, it should be related to the number of chunks that is involved, not the number of characters or the pieces of information in that set, so to speak. And so his hypothesis was supported by his findings. He found a strong correlation between the number of chunks and the time it took to transfer them. But there wasn't this correlation between the number of characters or words, again, the individual pieces of information, and the time that it took to transfer to long-term memory. So the process of chunking, what actually kind of happens here? And so what humans appear to do is to recode information into chunks that are based on meaning and relevance. So going back to my phone number example. And our most effective short-term memory strategies are really just some forms of chunking. So looking for similarities, right? And then categorizing like with like is often a really go-to effective short-term memory strategy. However, there are some limitations to the process of chunking. So because chunking requires time and resources, it's only effective when you have enough time to do it well, so when you're not in a rush, or when the chunking strategy is really highly practiced. So the first time that you try to chunk something, it's not going to be as effective as if it was something that you had been trying to practice for, let's say, 3 months. So now that we've talked about short-term memory, let's talk about another characteristic that's been of interest to researchers, particularly that of forgetting in short-term memory. And so when I briefly discussed this earlier, I suggested that forgetting could occur by delay, that is the gradual sort of fading away of information over time, or by a process of interference, this new information writing over or erasing the old information. And so let's look at some of the evidence in the research for this idea of decay as a cause of forgetting. There were two classic studies that were done to look at the duration of information that stays in short-term memory. One was by Brown in 1958, and the other was by Peterson and Peterson in the following year. And these researchers, they hypothesized that this forgetting in short-term memory was primarily due to this decay process. And so in their studies, subjects were presented with a consonant trigram, which is just another fancy, ridiculous word for just a group of 3 consonants. And then there's a distractor task that is presented. And so what participants had to do was they had to count backwards by 3s out loud from that number until it was time to recall that trigram. And so the reasoning for this was if subjects couldn't rehearse the trigram because they had to count backwards by 3, then the loss of memory from the trigram would be due to decay. So looking at this example that I have here on this slide, you as a participant are told, okay, the next series of letters that you are to remember are X, J, F. And then the number that you're supposed to count backwards from by 3s is 481. So then you as a participant would say, okay, 481, 478, 475, 472, 469, 466, etc., until the prescribed delay period came. And then the researcher would say, okay, stop. What were the 3 letters? And you would be like, And so these researchers found that subjects' ability to recall was impaired after 3 seconds of doing this distractor task. So, depending on how quickly you count, by the time you get to, maybe the 3rd or 4th number that you're supposed to calculate, your memory for the trigram has already been significantly reduced. And they found that when subjects were having to recall after a much longer period of time, so like 15 to 18 seconds, their recall dropped to about 10%. So really seeing this impact of time on our memory ability, our short-term memory ability. And we also want to talk about this evidence, possible evidence for an interference processing leading to forgetting. And so Wog and Norman, they challenged Peterson and Peterson's conclusions about their consonant trigram task showing decay. And so these researchers argued, well, actually interference is is probably due to the demands of the distractor task, right? That the distractor task is actually probably writing over participants' memory. And so to test this, they used what's called a probe digit task, and they varied the presentation time of the probe, which I'll talk about in a second, in order to look at decay. And then they varied the position of this probe in order to look at interference. And so with this probe digit task, subjects were presented with a list of 16 digits. And then at the end of the list, a a probe was presented. And so then subjects had to recall the number that occurred after the probe in the list. So essentially given this target letter, so after, or target number, so after 16 digits, if we look at our example on the slide here, so it was like, okay, 4. Which number came after 4? And then you had to be like, and so, like I said, in order to study decay, they varied the rate of presentation of the items. So some of the lists were presented really fast. So 4 items per second, which I don't even know how you would comprehend what was being said. And then there was also a slower rate where they did like one number per second. And then to investigate the effects of interference, like I said, they varied the position of the probe. So depending on how close or far away from the end of the list. So again, keeping in mind this primacy and recency effect. And these researchers found that the recall curves were nearly the same, regardless of the rate of presentation, but that there was more loss. There was more memory loss as the number of items between the probe and the end of the list increased. And so from these findings, they concluded that the results from Brown and Peterson were probably due to the interference of the distractor task rather than due to decay itself. So another idea in short-term memory is this idea of there being some sort of code that we use in order to hold this information. And so in terms of auditory information, there was this existence of an articulatory acoustic code that was assumed. And researchers verified just over and over that the types of errors that subjects made were based on verbal or sound confusions. And so it wasn't this visual confusion that occurred, but really the sound confusion. So, well, therefore, there must be some sort of sound code that's being used. But there's been research that has also found that, well, it seems like we have semantic codes, so meaning-based codes, and also imaginal codes or visual codes. And so some evidence for this idea of a semantic code came from Wickelgren and colleagues in 1980, because they found that semantic changes, so meaning changes across 3-word lists in short-term memory, that there wasn't this negative impact on performance, that actually changes in the meaning of words actually improved subjects' recall of words on the list. And Schulman also presented word lists, and they were lists of 10 words, and they were followed by a probe, or it's this sort of idea of the target, that subjects had to then judge how well the probe matched with a word on the list. And so sometimes the probe was set up so that it was an exact match, so it was identical to what was on the list. And other times the probe was a synonym for a word on the list. So there's this idea that it was a semantic match. And so Schulman's reasoning was that, well, if there's no semantic information in our short-term memory, then when probes are synonyms, then people should have no difficulty saying, oh yeah, that probe is a synonym. But if there is semantic information, people are going to be a lot more likely to make errors. And so this is the case. Subjects did in fact make a lot more errors on the probes that were synonyms, that had semantic similarities. And they actually judged these probes that were synonyms as saying identical. Oh, yeah, that was exactly the word that I heard on that word list, rather than, oh, that was a synonym for a word that I heard on that word list. And finally, some evidence for this idea of there being a sort of visual code. Um, and Alan Piveo actually came up with this idea that there's actually this dual code system that we use. And so depending on the type of task that we have to accomplish, we would then use either a verbal or a visual code, whichever was going to give us the best performance. And some of the strongest evidence for this is from mental rotation studies. And in these studies, subjects were presented with this the standard figure and then a set of comparison figures, and then asked whether any of the comparisons matched the standard. And so each of the figures that were to be used for comparison to the standard figure, they were really complicated 3D figures, and they could differ from the standard not only in shape, but also in orientation, so how they were flipped around. And so in order to judge these comparisons against the standard, subjects had to rotate or reorient the composition of the comparison objects so that it was in the exact same orientation as the standard. And so these experimenters found that, well, the more subjects had to reorient a comparison figure, the longer it took them to make their response. And this suggested that they were actually reorienting an image in their short-term memory. So they needed more time to reorient or spin or flip that image in order to compare it to the standard and see whether it was an exact match or not. And we also see this effect with more simple stimuli, like letters in the alphabet that are oriented in different directions. And if we were only using some type of verbal or semantic code, then the time it took us to reorient a stimulus, it wouldn't affect the amount of time it took us to make a judgment. But we do see that this is the case. Well, when we are using, when we are encountering more stimuli that are visual in nature, it does take us longer to reorient it and make a judgment, thus suggesting that we have this visual sort of code, this imaginal sort of code that we're using in short-term memory. Okay, and that's where we'll stop for today. And I look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday. Take care.